Your Humanities Half Hour is brought to you by the Northern Marianas Humanities Council, navigating the human experience together.
Hafade Tiro, and welcome to your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry, and today we are chatting with the 2023 Governor's Humanities Awardee for Research and Publication in the Humanities, Ajani Burrell. Ajani, welcome, and welcome back to Saipan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. It's an honor.
You've been gone for a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit more in the other half of the show about why. But first of all, let's advise our viewers about this publication that you received an award for, a Marianas Mosaic. What's it all about?
A Marianas Mosaic was a collaboration years in the making with a colleague at NMC. It was generously supported by the Humanities Council. They really helped to make it happen. And it's a book that essentially tries to capture various aspects of life in the Marianas today, or in the relatively recent past, what we would call contemporary times. 20 or so contributors, 22 chapters, if I'm recalling correctly, diverse collection of voices, perspectives, but all focused on exploring what life is like in the Marianas today.
Like you said, it's really diverse, and it's really wonderful that you were able to pull all of those voices together. So you were the lead editor, kind of pulling everybody together, and then you also contributed a couple chapters.
I did.
I remember one was basically about contemporary apparel related to the Marianas, and how this is now a fad. I don't know if fad is the right word because it's continuing now, but what was that all about, and why write about that?
Well, you know, it's really funny. I mean, this is now years ago when I first got the idea, and since we've been working on the project that led to the book. But I got to Saipan in 2013, and a couple years after that, I really just started noticing everywhere you looked, people wearing branded clothing that somehow represented or had to do with the Marianas culture, the location, the Marianas Trench, all sorts of different aspects of and characteristics of the region and the culture and the people. And I was just fascinated at how quickly it proliferated. One day there was nobody wearing these things, or almost no one, and then the next day
There were
it seemed
four
like
businesses.
everybody, and then not just four. There were 20 or so odd different companies.
Wow.
In 2015 producing this branded clothing, and I draw a comparison in the chapter to similarly sized places like La Crosse, Wisconsin had about the same population at that time as the Marianas, and not even the Marianas, just the CNMI. 13 of those companies were actually in the CNMI. And so that's the equivalent of literally in La Crosse or LaCroix, Wisconsin, there being 13 companies producing La Crosse branded Wisconsin clothing. I mean,
That's a lot of pride.
Yeah, it would just never happen. But that was happening here all at the same time. All these companies, all this awesome clothing and related accessories and stuff like that. And so that, just how quickly it came about and just what it may suggest had me really intrigued. And so that's why I ended up pursuing it as a sort of chapter in the book.
Okay, and what was your other contribution?
The other contribution was about neighborly dynamics in Rhoda, and it was called May I Borrow Some Soy Sauce? Change in sort of neighborly dynamics in Rhoda.
Okay. So I didn't get to ask, how did you feel when you found out that you were getting an award from the governor for writing about local where?
I was certainly very humbled. I was surprised. But also thankful. I appreciate the acknowledgement that the award sort of conveys. There was a lot of hard work that went into the book. But I think it's also not just an award for me. I mean, the award was for the book itself, I think, and I have to give credit to all of the co-contributors, all the people that contributed their time and energy and intellectual ideas to the book. And so it was an acknowledgement of that work, and a lot of that work was supported by a lot of great people.
And I know you've described it before, really like how much work it was, and really it took a long time for this book to come into fruition, and you were, the fire, really, I think that got it to come out. So thank you for that. What do you hope this book will accomplish now that it's on Amazon, on the shelf? What do you hope this book will do for our community?
A few things. For starters, I hope that it accomplishes what we set out to accomplish with the project in the beginning, which is to continue to sort of elevate and amplify voices and perspectives of the Marianas, to share some of the Marianas with the wider world. That was, speaking of the clothing brand article, that was actually one of the motivations that some of the brand creators spoke of, which was sort of repping the Marianas, to bring the Marianas to the world. And that's one of the driving forces actually for them of creating all these brands. And so it's a similar sort of thing. I also hope, and this was also sort of embedded in undertaking the project from the outset, we really hope that it serves sort of as an example of what's possible, so that other individuals in the Marianas, from young people to old people, see what's possible, what can be produced in the Marianas, all the value that is here, all the important ideas and worldviews and culture, and that people can feel empowered in a way to pursue what interests them, particularly if it is of a local design, of a local concern, and try and bring it to the world and share it with the world. So we hope that people being able to open up this book and read lots of different writing, literature from lots of different types of people and lots of different voices, but all from and about the Marianas, that anybody that encounters it may feel some small inspiration that they can do the same.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've taken what kind of started, I guess, with Marianas Mosaic and capturing and amplifying the indigenous voice into the current part of your life, which has to do with your doctoral work. Let's take a break, and then we come back to chat more about that. Cool?
Sure.
All right. We'll be back after this break.
Hafaday, Zantiro. I'm Leo Pangilinan with the Northern Marianas Humanities Council. We'd like to take a moment to thank our generous sponsors who have made possible the many programs in our community like this show. We couldn't have done it without them. And if you value the work we do and would like to make a contribution to our efforts, we ask that you consider making an in-kind or cash contribution to the Northern Marianas Humanities Council. Any amount is appreciated, and donations of up to $5,000 qualify for an educational tax credit. We appreciate your partnership and support. Sizus Maasi, Olomai, and thank you.
Welcome back to your Humanities Half Hour. We are chatting with the 2023 Governor's Humanities Award recipient for research and publication in the humanities, Ajani Burrell. Ajani, congratulations. You have decided to undertake the arduous task of earning your doctorate.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about it.
You are correct. It is arduous. perhaps a little bit more arduous even than I would have anticipated or foresaw. And there's obviously some things that you don't even know. But I chose to pursue a doctorate in a slightly atypical path, I guess, from most people, in the sense that I'm pursuing it in Europe at Johannes Gutenberg Universität in Mainz, which is outside of Germany. It's actually a really large university in Germany, I think 20,000 or so students. And I am pursuing it in the Anglophone Studies department.
Now, I had to ask you earlier, what is Anglophone Studies?
Yeah. Essentially, Anglophone Studies is the study of language and culture in places that speak English, but receive that English sort of via colonization or other uptake, not in English-speaking nations, sort of, that are native English-speaking nations.
Like the Marianas.
Like the Marianas.
All right.
Yeah, the Marianas, all of Micronesia, all of the Pacific, in fact. Almost everywhere in the Pacific is, the lingua franca is English. And so those are all, can be considered part of the Anglophone world. Yeah.
Why did you choose to pursue this area of study?
A few reasons. One is I've lived here now for 10 years. I have always enjoyed being here, enjoyed being exposed to the culture, meeting people here, living here. My family and I love it. And that is sort of what, in part, inspired Marianas Mosaic, the book. And so in a way, it's a continuation of that appreciation. But there are other reasons as well. I am a sort of, by trade or training, a literary studies person. I have an MFA in creative writing. Really enjoy literature, and so fusing those two things, the appreciation for the culture and the people here in the Marianas, and an appreciation of literature, sort of resulted in this doctoral work that explores some aspects of indigenous literature in the Marianas.
You know, I hadn't really thought of this before, but, after you get your doctorate, what do you hope will be the outcome of all this research you're putting into, as we said, the indigenous voice? Other than you having doctor in front of your name, which is always great, comes with a salary increase, prestige, all these great things. But really, because this is really a big portion of your life that you're putting into these studies. Why? Or what do you hope will come from it?
Well, for starters, I really hope that to sort of bring more light or exposure to the fantastic literature that's being produced here in the region. One of the reasons, sort of another reason why I undertook it, is that the literature here of the Marianas it seems to me, in my estimation, to be understudied or underrepresented. There has been some movement of late in that regard. People have been coming to it more. There's been some increased notoriety for Marianas writers. Craig Santos Perez is grown very large in the literary world these days, and in the indigenous literary world. And there's been a lot of focus on poetry, as it were. Is much of the scholarship and research on literature, which of the Marianas, which is, again, isn't much.
Yeah.
Most of it tends to focus on poetry. And I wanted to try and provide some exposure for the non-poetic literature that is being and has been produced by people of the Marianas. So I hope in that regard that, again, the sort of outcome or ancillary product to the actual research itself is that, again, people sort of see what's possible, right? And that people actually know a little bit more about the literature that's being produced here, because very few people ever have exposure to it. So if I can help to contribute to increasing that exposure, more people, just a few more people even, hearing about Julian Ogden or Chris Perez Howard or any of these other people that have been and are writing literature in the Marianas, that 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 other people have heard these names, have heard about this work that's being produced, then I think I've accomplished something.
I would say so. In looking at some of the papers you've presented and abstracts, maybe we could start off with this word, and you can explain it way better than I could. So I'm just going to try. I'm just going to introduce it and turn it over to you.
Sure.
Okay. So it talks about talanoa, which of course I looked it up, right?
Yeah.
Incredible word, Fijian word. It's being used kind of across the Pacific, though. What is it, and how does it relate to the indigenous voice and your work?
Sure. So talanoa is a sort of South Pacific cultural practice, very prevalent in Fiji, as you mentioned, Samoa, Tonga, and it comes from the culture, and it essentially means to literally translated, it means to talk about nothing. Now, that obviously is not exactly what we sort of understand it to mean, particularly in the West. It's a kind of unstructured, open dialogue that has at its heart a few very foundational cultural values that make it so powerful. And ultimately what it is usually used to do, there's euphemisms for it. It's sometimes called rolling out the mat, where families very often sit around and talk in an unstructured way to try and build understanding, reach compromise, find solutions, but it's unstructured. And so that's the cultural practice that is talanoa.
And I think it's marked
old.
by, you were talking about the values like honesty, transparency, or open, you said, maybe that's the talking about nothing part, is you just talk and you just speak from your heart.
Correct. It's another euphemism is talking from the heart. It is characterized by open, earnest, emotional conversation that is relational, right? So people appreciate the relationships between the people in the conversation. It's reciprocal. So it has a lot of traditional or indigenous or epistemological values that make it a powerful tool. And that's the cultural practice. It has since become perhaps the most widely used Pacific indigenous research method. It has sort of evolved into a research method where people use it to explore various topics. Lots of them have to do with the social sciences. It is very often used in educational circles. That's probably its most common use. But it's still, and again, in that regard, it's sort of similar to interview or dialogue, but it's endowed with these Pacific indigenous values that make it different. And so that's the sort of framework that I'm using, or approach or method that I'm using to conduct this research. So I'm looking at it as,
in other words, you're not really doing surveys.
Not doing surveys. Not doing surveys.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. No, but please continue. So you're using it to explore various indigenous writings, or in what way is it applied to your work?
So it's I consider myself sort of putting the various indigenous writing, and the writing I'm looking at is contemporary indigenous narratives of the Marianas. So essentially stories of various forms. So I'm taking these stories and I'm putting them in talanoa, which to sort of use a more familiar term, putting them in conversation in various ways. Each chapter sort of does this slightly differently, but doing it always with an eye on and through the lens of these indigenous values that endow Talanoa with its power. And so there's these conversations, as it were, are happening in a number of different ways, based on the specific literature that I'm looking at.
You know, this technique of research actually sounds very familiar to me as part of like the Carolinian culture, because a lot of just in a couple of ways. One is like, it's a little bit different now, but especially when I was younger, when you go to somebody's house, you're not in a hurry. It's actually kind of rude if you're in a hurry. You should go and spend time and have this kind of dialogue and openness and leave space for whatever needs to be raised, or it's not even, doesn't have to be anything urgent, right? It could just be something that's on your mind, or you give. It's not like the first thing on your agenda when you show up, really. So it kind of reminds me of that. That's
interesting. I would, and I hadn't actually made that observation or connection, but I can certainly see what you mean in having been in those spaces. And appreciating how you describe it sort of unfolding. And I at least, again, I've only been here 10 years, but I've noticed that still seems to transpire today. It's not a thing that is sort of that approach. And it's also interesting because there is no, you're right, that Talanoa is sort of a kind of pan-Pacific practice. It's common, or at least recognized in much of Polynesia. But there's no, as far as I understand it, as far as the research has revealed to me, there's no direct equivalent in, say, Chamorro culture. There's no direct equivalent to a Talanoa. So I'm very curious now to perhaps look a little bit more into whether there is a more direct equivalent in Carolinian culture, because I do hope to do some of that exploration as well as part of this research.
Cool.
Yeah.
So
thank you for that.
You're welcome.
For
I'm glad I could contribute to your doctoral research.
I am glad you could too. It's awesome. I appreciate it.
One of the authors you mentioned, Julian Uggan, of course, you're kind of looking at his work a little bit closely. What is the interest there, and what are you exploring?
Julian's work is truly fascinating to me. I only encountered it a few years ago, but he recently published a sort of collection of, it's hard to even, it's obviously published as a collection of writings, but it's very diverse and eclectic.
It's really from his heart. This is what amazing. I feel, right?
Yeah. It's amazing.
It's like, I want to write a poem, now I want to write a short story, now I want to write a fictional, well, I don't know if he did that, but free flowing.
In those collections, I don't think there's any fiction in there. But yeah, very emotive, very resonant with people and with readers, and certainly with me. And so that was, just sort of as someone who appreciates literature, appreciates powerful literature, that just in and of itself was one reason why I really wanted to look more closely at Julian's work. It just so happened that a lot of this work, because he's published other things before, but they were much more social sciences, much more decolonial activism, legal. He graduated from law school and ended up practicing human rights lawyer, and so. But this was, when we talk about quote unquote literature, narratives, stories in various forms, poems. Oftentimes it also convey or carry a story, lots of imagery and powerful language. So this collection that was originally published by University of Guam Press, The Properties of Perpetual Light, and then was later republished only just a year later by Astor House under the title No Country for Eight-Spot Butterflies. The collection was just extremely powerful.
You used the word healing in describing it. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know how many times I've read the book at this point, and the first few times I read it that didn't occur to me. But the more I read it, the more it became obvious that it's, well, at least obvious to me, that it very much seems to me that in that work, Julian's, I would argue that Julian's chief goal in that collection is to try and affect some sort of spiritual healing for his people, the people of the Marianas, Chamorro people, but not just people of the Marianas. Frankly, lots of peoples, lots of cultures have been affected by the things that are affecting the Marianas, that are affecting the indigenous people of the Marianas. Certainly most, or if not all of the Pacific, it has suffered a lot of those things. And so he's not exclusively concerned about trying to necessarily affect some sort of spiritual healing just for the people here, but it seems to me that he's very much concerned about and believes that in order to continue the decolonial efforts that are underway, to continue to affect the cultural revitalization, that there needs to be an attention to the soul and the spirit of the people here who have undergone a great many traumas over the past 400 or so years, and the various effects and symptoms and outcomes of those traumas can be seen in various ways and forms, but the solution is a kind of soul healing. And that's very much what it seems to me that the work is doing. Now, I don't know whether, I haven't spoken to Julian yet about this. I plan to. That's part of sort of engaging in good, holistic, culturally appropriate Talanoa. I hope to eventually at some point speak to Julian or with Julian about these things. If he can carve out a little time for me. I know he's super busy. But that's what it seems. I don't know if he sort of set out with that, because the collection is a collection of writing that was produced over the years, and it comes from sort of fantastic commencement speeches that he gave. There's transcripts of commencement speeches that he gave at UOG, at Richardson Law, high school, his own high school where he graduated from. And so it's sort of a collection of different types of writing from different periods in his life. And so he could have, as he was fashioning the collection itself and putting it together and, deciding which work to draw on and include, he may have had that in mind, or it may just be a consequence of what he chose for some other reasons. So I don't know why he necessarily did, but it seems to me that the enduring message, if one is to find one in the collection, is that the people need to heal. It's sort of spiritual healing is the way forward. And he sort of offers some ways in which that can happen.
I know you're also looking at writings for people in the diaspora or people from the Marianas who live mostly in the States or other parts of the world. The cool thing is it sounds like with this doctoral work you really have the opportunity to look deeply into what is being produced and to kind of, as you were describing with Julian, kind of like follow this train of thought to see whether or not it's true or what do you hope will, what is your major goal for the first part of this work that you're doing?
Well, the diaspora studies, the sort of study of the narratives of the diaspora is very, very interesting because it's also so eclectic, right? There is no sort of universal Marianas or Chamorro diasporic writer or literature. They all, there's as it turns out, there's actually more Chamorros in the diaspora than here in the Marianas, and that has been for at least a couple decades now. That sort of travel, that migration has been happening for several decades now, essentially, seemingly increasingly over the years since World War II. So there's a multiplicity of voices out there, and so that's been the really interesting thing for me with the diaspora, with looking at the narratives of the diaspora. In terms of what I hope to accomplish or see with the sort of first part of the doctoral research, I mean, first and foremost, trying, however, in some small way, to simply introduce the voices and writers and literature of the Marianas and of people of Marianas descent to a wider world. So if I can write about and analyze 3 or 5 or 7 stories or a collection from writers in the Marianas that, granted, an admittedly small segment of the academic population will read, it is nevertheless just a few more eyes. Yeah. And so just contributing to that discourse, offering a little bit more exposure to those writers who are writing some great stuff. Mm-hmm. And then again, hopefully thereby, as I hopefully publish some of the work and contribute a little bit to that exposure, just having more people in the Marianas be aware of what is possible, what they can do if they are so inclined. If they want to write stories, they can. And now that we have ever more publication opportunities like Pro Publications at NMC, that there's avenues for those to come to the world and to find readers. Mm-hmm. So that's first and foremost, that's the initial early goals of undertaking the research.
Well, I want to thank you again and congratulate you again for your time and really wish you the best. We look forward to what comes out of this work that you're doing.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. And I hope to keep the work going.
All right. Our guest today has been Ajani Burrell. He's the 2023 Governor Humanities Awardee for Research and Publication in the Humanities. This has been your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry.
Your Humanities Half Hour has been made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Democracy demands wisdom. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. For more information or to share your thoughts, contact the Northern Marianas Humanities Council at nmhcouncil.org or on social media at 670 Humanities. That's 670 Humanities.